All right. Now I've got a nice setup where I can see some of your faces. So if anyone talks or wants to raise their hand, I'll probably be able to see you. But when it comes to the chat, anyone can feel free to interrupt me or raise my attention to it. But like Bob said, I'm Jack Crowley. I'm now a second year graduate student studying applied physics, but I do my research in Claudia Fischbach and Warren Zipfel's lab in biomedical engineering here. And I've been really excited about being involved with this Cornell Community Cancer Partnership in the past year since arriving in Ithaca. And I'm very happy to get to present Jewel Plummer Cobb's life and legacy to you this afternoon. So in the last two sessions, we heard some really cool cutting edge engineering techniques in cancer research that's applicable, very applicable today, and that includes studying the tumor microenvironment and cancer immunotherapy. But now we're going to look at what was cutting edge research 60, 70 years ago. And the woman that made a lot of the developments that led to what we can do and what we know today. So who is Jewel Plummer Cobb? It's not a household name, unfortunately, but Jewel was an incredible biologist who accomplished not only discovering mechanisms that are important for our understanding, particularly of melanoma today, but she also developed techniques in culturing tissue itself in vitro that is a very standard practice now. And at the time, she was pioneering that kind of research. Although she had a long career as a researcher where she contributed quite a lot to our understanding, she spent the later half of her career really focused with positions of academic leadership and used these positions at different institutions to advocate for increased representation of women and minorities throughout science, but especially in the graduate programs and in academic professions such as professorships, that she really was one of the earlier members in a time when Black women were not often presidents or deans or even professors. So in that way, she's become an icon with a great legacy that I'd love for us to talk about after hearing more about her life. So Jewel grew up in Chicago, Illinois, and I think her family speaks a lot to why she became a successful biologist herself. Her grandfather was, she was born again in 1924 and passed away a couple of years ago. But her grandfather was a freed slave who attended Howard University, where he got a degree that allowed him to become a pharmacist. And Howard University, for those that don't know, is an HBCU, or historically Black college and university. So he leveraged the ability to pursue education like that to become a pharmacist where he could help his community. Similarly, Jewel's mother, Cole, was college educated and was a dance and physical education instructor and teacher herself. This is the profession that Jewel first wanted to pursue after her mother. And her mom went back to college when Jewel was in university, so they happened to graduate together, which is pretty cool. Her father is also a really big deal in motivating how she chose to pursue her career. You might recognize, if you've been to Hope Plaza on Cornell's Ithaca campus, this stone and bench area. And if you look, it's a 100-year memorial to the founding of the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity on campus. Frank was one of those founding members, so that's a very cool local connection here. Frank was the first Black student to be awarded a doctorate of medicine from Cornell. And he was a physician. Not only, he didn't have a typical practice as we experience today, but he decided to set up on a corner near public transportation in Chicago, so that a lot of lower class, mostly Black families, had an option for seeing medical attention during their commute, so that they didn't need to take off time from work to tend to their health. So that was all pretty motivating to Jewel. Now, she was from an educated upper middle class family in Chicago, but this was long before Brown v. Board of Education. So Jewel found that she was restricted only to some very under-resourced public schools for Black students only. In the left, there's a picture of kind of the map of different schools and their segregation in Chicago. But Jewel wasn't entirely deterred by lower resources in her education, even though it was disappointing because she knew so many accomplished Black professionals in her life. So she knew she could become very successful in whatever she wanted to do also. So what she decided to do was just supplement her education with the access to medical libraries that her father gave her. So she would be reading papers and periodicals in a high school that may still be a struggle for someone like me today. And it was in high school when she got to study cells under a microscope that she became interested in studying biology rather than physical education. She wanted to study cells and the disease itself rather than following her father's career as a physician and working one-on-one with patients, though. I'll say that as she lived in Chicago, which is pretty close to Michigan, she and her family they took a lot of trips to Michigan. She was very fond of it. And at this time, it was pretty impressive that the University of Michigan had over 200 enrolled Black students across the different degrees. So these things considered, she thought Michigan would be a great place to go to study biology. Unfortunately, what she saw when she arrived in 1942 was very disappointing to her. There was kind of rampant segregation and exclusion socially and in housing and other things. And after 3 semesters, she had had enough and decided to transfer to Talladega College, which is in Alabama. And Talladega College didn't accept any transfer credits, but she still managed to achieve her degree in only 2 years, I believe. And although Talladega College didn't have the educational resources of the huge research institution that Michigan was, it made up for that by giving Jewel some incredible access to mentors who she became very close with. One in particular was her bacteriology professor, who she referred to as Captain Jack, who encouraged her to pursue her studies beyond the bachelor's degree and go for graduate study at New York University. But in her own words, I don't want to try playing clips of videos and things like that over the Zoom, but hopefully my voice can communicate a little bit of what she thought. The choice of the University of Michigan was a disaster for Black students in terms of dormitory living arrangements. The assignment to a league house was given only to Black students because we were not allowed to live in the dormitories. Also, the popular grills in the famous Pretzel Belt Tavern did not welcome Black students. And so I was never allowed in the mainstream of social life on campus. No Black students belonged to the big fraternities and sororities. The situation prompted my parents and me to consider leaving Michigan. And I didn't mention this, but she did join a sorority at Talladega College, which was, I believe, Alpha Kappa Alpha. But when she went for a graduate study, she was accepted to NYU, as was recommended by her professor, but she was rejected from a teaching fellowship, and this is allegedly because she was Black. But when she arrived, she was not really deterred by this. She made sure meetings happened with the faculty, and she impressed them so much that they completely overturned that decision and offered her the fellowship, the teaching fellowship. Over the course of the next few years, she studied complex enzymatic reactions and biochemistry in yeast cells for her master's thesis, before shifting into the PhD program, deciding that research and academia were where she wanted to take her career. Her dissertation thesis, Mechanisms of Pigment Formation, is a foreshadowing to a lot of the research that she would study for the rest of her career. And as I mentioned early on, she focused on melanoma quite a bit. But while still a grad student, in 1949, she was appointed as an independent investigator at a kind of legendary institution in biology, the Marine Biology Laboratory, which is in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. But following her PhD dissertation, she received 3 very impressive and competitive postdoctoral fellowships, one at Columbia University, one with the National Cancer Institute, but most importantly, one brought her to the Cancer Research Foundation at Harlem Hospital. So Dr. Lewis Wright's image is here. He'll come up again throughout this presentation, but he started this Cancer Research Foundation, and he himself was a really accomplished individual. He was the first Black graduate of Harvard Medical School. So in that way, he has some parallel to Jewel's father. So back to her PhD thesis, the dissertation on mechanisms of pigment granule formation. In this image on the left, you can see what these look like under a microscope. These are these granules are exactly what give skin its tint. They contribute to the color of your iris and your hair. But at this time, little was known about it, and Jewel was very interested in it. So what she studied was this enzyme, and the full enzyme is not in view. I hope this image isn't too hard to follow, but what is going on here is there's this white and reddish pink cloud of a big representation of a macromolecule, this enzyme tyrosinase. And inside a pocket that has not only a lot of red, which means it's very electronegative, but also a couple of metallic elements. A lot's going on in this catalytic core. And she studied how, because this is the natural enzyme that creates melanin, which is on the right here, it has to do some very fancy biochemistry to produce this very complicated and cool structure of melanin. But she studied how you could use in vitro petri dish type systems and create melanin granules, such as the image on the left yourself. So why was she interested in melanin? It's stuff that we take for granted how much we know about this today, but it's a really cool chemical that dissipates almost 100% of the energy that's received through UV radiation. So this naturally tells you that since we know UV radiation is very damaging to a number of different types of cells, being able to dissipate this energy efficiently is a really good natural prevention for things like melanoma. And it's found not only in the skin, but also the iris and hair, like I said before, but also in the heart and the brain. It's all over the place in many different organs. And there are many other types of enzymes that use these kind of metallic catalytic cores to carry out complex biochemical reactions. And there may be some in the audience that study these kinds of reactions themselves. So related to this dissertation, from Jules' words, I was, of course, extremely nervous. Despite that, I was comforted deep down inside with the awareness that I knew much more about my subject, mechanisms of pigment granule formation, than anyone else in the world. She worked with her advisor incredibly hard to make sure her dissertation was leak-proof. It could pass the test of the harshest critic they could think of. They worked incredibly hard, and that owes to her tenacity and also her working to be this confident in herself. So in the postdoc appointments that I mentioned before, especially with Harlem Hospital, she started developing the 3 key specialties to her research for her kind of research-focused element of her career. And that's melanoma, tissue culture, and then cell-specific toxicity. So the first specialty can be summarized as the factors influencing the growth, morphology, and genetic expression of normal and neoplastic pigment cells. So pigment cells, these are a specialized cell type in beneath the top surface of your skin. So in the left, there's this squarish model of a section of what your skin tissue looks like close up. You can see hair follicles and hairs coming out all the way down to, I believe, muscular tissue and fat tissue beneath the surface. And if you zoom in near the top, near the surface, there are these interesting dark red cells, and blown up on the right, these are melanocytes. They carry out the reaction that we talked about from her thesis of producing these melanosomes, which are the organelle of just accumulated melanin. And then it has these really long dendrites that extend and snake between the cells to kind of deliver these melanocytes, which are excreted and then called melanin granules throughout the epidermis. And this altogether ends up giving skin its tint and protection from solar radiation. So like I mentioned, Lewis Wright was the founder of this Cancer Research Foundation at Harlem Hospital. And his daughter, Jane C. Wright, became a long-term collaborator of Jules. They, I would think, have a lot in common with each other, since both of their fathers were very accomplished Black physicians from different med schools, and drove their kids to work really, really hard in the sciences. And so they were 2 pioneering Black female researchers in this field of cancer research. Now, Jane was studying mouse models and how you can research cancer through the use of these other model systems. And Jules started to complement that research by developing new techniques that could use excised tissue from autopsies or biopsies and keep the cells alive so that they could be experimented with different types of chemicals and factors to see how the healthy and malignant tissues would behave. 3 of the ones that we'll talk about in a second are TEM, which is radiomimetic compound. That means it's a chemical that kind of does to tissue what radiation itself does, even though it would have to be very different mechanisms, it kind of mimics this activity. Oromycin is an antibiotic, and then she also explored derivatives of folic acid, which is a crucial element to cell maintenance and survival. The third expertise that Jewel developed in this time was in researching cell-specific toxicities. She worked closely with Grace Antikejan, which I hope I'm remotely close to pronouncing. And you can explain this as the changes produced in vitro by cancer chemotherapeutic agents, hormones, and other agents known to disrupt cell division. And this expertise is really something that I feel a lot of researchers at Cornell are doing this exact thing today. But at the time, this was still a very difficult thing to be studying. So I'll go into what this paper means, but it was a hopeful study of finding the way that the chemicals interact with healthy and malignant tissues. So in her words, we described in 1951 certain cytotoxic changes. TEM in vitro at lower doses prevented human tumor cells from migrating along the flask surfaces. Amethopterin at significantly low doses caused nuclei to enlarge, while uromycin at similar concentrations had no effect. Following these postdoc appointments at different institutions, she began taking off on her career as an independent investigator. She first went to University of Illinois Medical School, where she set up the first tissue culture lab in this medical school. And today that's kind of a crazy thought, but she did that not only at Illinois, but at other institutions along her career path. She studied normal and malignant pigment cells, so those melanocytes. 2 years later, she came back to Harlem Hospital Cancer Research Foundation, and now Jane Wright is the director. And only a year later, that foundation is kind of absorbed into NYU's postgraduate medical school. And at this time, Jewel's appointed as an assistant professor, so her first role as an academic professional. She thought that the research that Jewel and Jane got to work on at this point was among the most exciting of her career, and it involves mouse models of melanoma. From her perspective, this is kind of summarizing some of their results. They discovered that pigmented tissue slices survived in vitro radiation at X-ray doses that prevented growth of pale tissue when implanted into mice. Melanin protected the cells from X-ray damage. So this, again, is really some of the more fundamental knowledge that researchers today base a lot of what we explore on. So it's amazing to kind of peek at who was discovering this and what was the world of research like at that time for something so fundamental. So after the experience at NYU, she took a full professorship role at Sarah Lawrence in 1960, was there for 9 years, and then left to become Dean of Connecticut College. And this is a big deal. There is a lot of responsibilities in simultaneously being a professor and a dean holding an active research laboratory. So because of this exceptional amount of responsibility, she worked really hard to keep it all going. So she worked early in the morning in her research lab and then spent the rest of the day working on her dean administrative duties. And at this time, she also took a big interest in advocating and supporting the development of more minority and women scientists. So what she did for the first time here is to develop a program that would support very accomplished minority students who had finished their bachelor's degree and then decided they wanted to go to med school or dental school. And she set up a 1-year program where they could basically redirect their lives if they had made that decision to pursue these degrees too late. This is kind of a similar model to what is becoming more prevalent today. Post-bac programs are a cool idea in a supplemental year that goes after a bachelor's degree to help students prepare for medical degrees. So it's a model that stuck, but it really was helpful in her community. And her status as a national scientist really developed after her work with Jane Wright and then being a successful dean and professor. She was in 1974 appointed the first Black woman to the National Science Board. And the National Science Foundation, being one of the biggest sources of public funding for research or research at all, the National Science Board is the group of individuals that decide how that money is going to be directed. So taxpayer money could be directed to any type of research, and they set the guidelines for how they want research to be pursued, what they think is most important. And it's a really big responsibility in the scientific community. She also helped form the first iteration of the NSF's Committee on Women and Minorities in Science, and then 2 years later became a dean at Douglas College. But in 1981, she spent 10 years in what is probably her most important role in her career, and that was as president of California State University, Fullerton. And by taking this position, she was the first African-American woman west of the Mississippi to oversee such a large university in the United States, and she accomplished a lot in these 9 years. She was responsible for forming communications and engineering and a computer science schools, and then also for her work to support initiatives supporting diversity in STEM. So firstly, she launched similar pre-medical and pre-doctoral programs to what she had done at Connecticut College, but she actively worked to bring more women and more minorities into the faculty at Fullerton, as well as encouraging more diversity in the student population as well. And knowing that, like herself, many of these students may come from under-resourced high schools because of their demographic information, she worked to start a new tutoring program, a faculty tutoring program, to help a lot of these incoming students catch up in math and science so they could feel free to pursue any degree they wanted, including some of these challenging science and engineering degrees that require a lot of math. So in her words, after this tenure at Fullerton, she said, "I think I'd like to be remembered as a Black woman scientist who cared very much about what happens to young folks, particularly women going into science." I think this speaks very clearly to what her legacy is. She was not only a pioneer as a scientist, especially as a Black woman when that was a very rare thing, but she worked through education and through academia to support the next generation, and how can the institution support a much more balanced representation in ways that are unfortunately still a sticking point that take a lot of effort all around. So just to address how I think her legacy fits into the world today, she may be quite satisfied that we now are at a point where in biology, her field of study, women are currently awarded at least 50% of the degrees from the bachelor's level to the doctorate level. And this is one sign of things going in a great direction, but there is so much more to do. And I think, especially since I've spent my career in engineering and physical sciences, I think that it would be great to have more leadership and more people like Jewel Plummer Cobb directing these representations to also achieve more of this balance. However, on a kind of bright note, I'm not sure if everyone's caught up with this, but the Nobel laureates were announced in the past couple weeks, and the awards will be given in November, I believe. But it's very exciting to see that in the physical sciences, there have been 2 chemists and 1 physicist that are women celebrated for some of the biggest scientific achievements to date through CRISPR and black hole research. And just looking at this image on the right, if you think about when Jewel Plummer Cobb was growing up in the 20s and 30s, only a few women had been celebrated with such an award. And now, hopefully, seeing so many more women and minorities and minority women like Jewel herself could be really helpful for encouraging younger girls and younger minority students to see that this is a place where they can be celebrated for the great work that they do, which was not always the case. Now, minorities, the statistics of minorities awarded different degrees in science and engineering is also something that is worth talking about and following through many of our careers. There is, over time, what looks like a positive trend in the number of different degrees awarded to underrepresented minorities in science and engineering. But if we particularly consider Black students for receiving these degrees in science and engineering and kind of divvied up by discipline, there is a disappointing lack of progress in stimulating this diversity. And I, at least as long as I've been interested in research and degree programs such as these, have found that a lot of people are making it their mission to make this representation far more balanced. But unfortunately, the trends don't seem to be reflecting that quite yet. So I am hoping that we can have some bit of discussion about what people think about this. But before ending, I want to also note that these HBCUs, like the one that Jewel's grandfather went to and Jewel went to herself, seem to be very successful in encouraging minority students to pursue graduate studies, where the statistics are 15% of Black students that receive bachelor degrees do so from these institutions. So they're supporting the bachelor degree load of 15%. However, if you tally up all of the Black students receiving postgraduate degrees, 25% of those are awarded to students who, in their bachelor degree, went to these HBCUs. So they've been historically doing a really good job preparing preparing their students to pursue graduate studies and encouraging them to do so. And that is everything. Thank you all very much for your attention. I'm really glad that I could present and learn about such an amazing researcher from the last century. And I hope that we can all make her proud with carrying that legacy on. But thank you so much.